Pete, good to catch up.
Hey.
It's been a while. I was delighted that we get a chance to grab a tea and talk about national benchmarking. It's clearly a very, very strong growth area for us, and clearly something that solidly differentiates us from our, I guess anyone in the marketplace. I guess probably where best to start is if you can offer your insight as to how national benchmarking came about, because it's intrinsically linked with the growth of the business. And it would be very useful to understand the context in the offer.
Absolutely. Well, we've been benchmarking for nations right from the start of the business. I mean, all the way back to 2007 with the first benchmarking projects for the UK government. Since then we've done a number of benchmarking projects for the UK government, and all the North Sea governments are now expanding to governments around the world. So it's something that's been with us the whole time. And as you say, it's growing with us as a business, starting off in a very consultative capacity, dealing with only the data that's being supplied by governments. These days dealing with much more high-tech data science, dealing with international analogues and bringing all that and melding that with benchmark analysis. So it's something that's growing and changing as we go, but very much part of us as a business. And really helping nation states understand what their potential is in the ground. That's what it's all about, and that hasn't changed. That is still constant.
Yeah, it's clearly something that has enabled us to interact at very high level within government organisations that have responsibility for hydrocarbon extraction. Clearly it has also been very useful for us to have the credibility of delivering to our domestic UK government. It's been a brilliant reference point. How is the UK's best practice perceived internationally? Is that a positive when we do speak to market?
Well, I think it is. I mean, the UK is a very mature basin, so it's always kind of people looking to it to see what's happening in the future as an analogue to their own basins and where fields are going to go. And we've obviously been through that cycle now in the UK of fields churning over from super majors and a small number of operators to a much more diverse mix of operators. And that brings challenges for the nation state. There's many more relationships to deal with. There's a whole different level of backing behind those operators in terms of international technical teams, etc. And so what we've found with the UK is that the UK government has become much more involved commercially in its own basin to maximise economic recovery. And so other nations that we're dealing with are seeing that and are starting to take steps on that journey. And we can help them with that with benchmarking.
Yeah. It's certainly been evident over the last 3 or 4 years that there is a willingness to seek out best practice from around the world with a lot of the countries that we are targeting and trying to develop relationships with. And I would echo that. I think the UK is perceived very, very positively in relation to what they've implemented by the Oil and Gas Authority and then subsequently and the current guys, the North Sea Transition Authority. That has helped us as an organisation from a credibility perspective, most certainly. A lot of the countries that we are dealing with in terms of ongoing projects or targeting are also in a similar situation in relation to they've got quite a mature industry. They've been producing for a number of years. Taking Africa, or more specifically Sub-Saharan Africa, as a kind of context to focus in on here, what would you deem their kind of main challenges in relation to optimising what they have in the ground? What's been your observations when we've had interaction?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, I think that some of the challenges are common, as I just mentioned. The exit or the pending exit of super major companies, and countries to start to take ownership, particularly of their data. That is a challenge. So data has sometimes been held in Houston or held in London or held elsewhere, and it's not been really known intimately locally. And there's a real big challenge and a need actually to get that data together as operators exit particularly, and to bring that data and to really own that data as a nation, to understand that data. The power is in the data, because if we don't know the data, we don't know the potential, and we can't access that potential in the future.
Yeah.
So that's a key challenge, is to bring that data firstly back under the control of the particular government, the ministry, the national oil company, what have you. I think that the second key challenge that we often see is the availability of local expertise. So bringing that local content, bringing the local engineers, geoscientists up to date when they get their hands on that data, up to date with benchmarking techniques, exposing them to international analog benchmarking techniques, and that's something we're really passionate about. We really want to do that at Belltree, is to go into countries, work with ministries, work with local partners and those ministries, upskill people and give them the real cutting edge, state-of-the-art tools and techniques when it comes to analog data benchmarking.
Yeah. Well, it certainly leaves a positive legacy, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And embedding best practice to be applied for 10, 15 years, 20 years out. I think that's very important, and we are super conscious of that. We want to ensure that when we deliver something meaningful, it's not just the insights that are provided, it's the longer term benefit to the ultimate stakeholders, the sovereign nation people, which is very key. So if you have a scenario whereby you've got Ministry of Energy or a Ministry of Petroleum, Mines and Hydrocarbon, what are the typical challenges that they face in relation to understanding what they have under the ground, and the challenges around getting the most out of the assets? And if I elaborate a little bit further, operators that have been awarded blocks obviously have a vested interest in optimising what they can, but perhaps from an observational perspective, there hasn't necessarily been complete alignment in relation to understanding from an operator perspective versus the actual regulatory body within any given country that we've spoken with. How does national benchmarking analysis shore up that particular gap? Can you give us some insight into that?
Yeah. Well, I think it all comes back down to data at the end of the day, and the change of the role of the government to becoming more of a partner in fields and less of kind of just an oversight or HSE provider. And that's very much the journey of the UK. What we saw after we did the benchmarking studies in the UK is a real shift in paradigm thinking in the relationship between the government and the operators.
Yeah.
Part of the problem pre-benchmarking studies was that the government didn't have up-to-date data from the operators. Mm-hmm. The operators saw it as an overhead to provide that data, and companies are always going to reduce their overheads when they don't see a benefit. So providing data to the government, they saw there was no benefit coming back. And what benchmarking allowed that to change was the government was able to echo back insights to the operators from our benchmarking studies, because they were able to collate that data in a non-commercially competitive way and echo those insights back. Now the operators absolutely love that, and it really changed that relationship. Suddenly they were happier to provide data and to spend that money because they were getting some insights back. So it was a real force multiplier for both sides of the equation there. And we think that's absolutely going to be the case in other basins. As we said, going back to the challenges, sometimes it's challenging to get data off the operators for governments. If we can show that there's a force multiplier, a positive good, then commercial interest will kick in and things will improve across the board.
Indeed. And we've seen that in action. We've obviously delivered a number of these projects globally, and we are very much in our own right a pioneer applying this methodology. This is something that clearly sets us apart as an organisation, and coupled with our product, our flagship product, BMark, it really does set us apart from perhaps other organisations working with data in the field. As a regulator, what does a national benchmarking project look like? what is the requirement, and what will the outputs be? What can they expect to achieve through the methodology?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so we break it down into a number of steps. Obviously, each project is slightly different depending on the context of the nation, but we can generalise to an extent. I think the first step is a data discovery stage, and that's a stage of Belltree experts coming in and working with the client, in this case the regulator, say, and discovering what data is there, its vintage, its reliability, and where there might be gaps in that data set.
Yes.
We then help that regulator to go and access that data, updated data sets, typically from the operators, and we put together questionnaires. We work with them in that regard, and again, it's a case by case in terms of that. But there's a big focus on improving the quality of the underlying data set first, before we start to get to the more data analytics or machine learning side of things. That's really where our experience comes, is that 80% of the work is getting the data right, getting the data quality right. So after we've done that step, we move to we basically work with that data in-house here at Belltree and apply our machine learning techniques, and we build bespoke benchmarks for that nation. So these are predictive benchmarks using their data, and sometimes teamed with international analogues if appropriate, to build up predictive benchmarks. And what these benchmarks do is they allow us to rank all of the fields in the nation, all the reservoirs in the fields, and see which are the leaders and which are the laggards. So in that specific context of the nation, we can then highlight fields which are underperforming their potential, and we can focus the rest of the study on those fields. So we can then dive deep into those fields and see why they might be underperforming. So they might need infill drilling, they might need improved recovery, what have you, and we can then take the study in a really focused way from there. Typically we're then zooming down from hundreds of assets down to a handful of assets which we can really help the operator to focus on as the key potential.
Fantastic. So through the process, at a high level, what we're really doing is identifying underperformance and the missed upside potential within.
Absolutely. And on the flip side of that, also recognising fields that are doing very well and trying to learn from those fields. So there may be consistent reasons why the top quartile fields are doing very well.
Yeah.
And we can then take those learnings and see if we can apply them to the bottom quartile.
Fantastic. So it's quite a comprehensive value that's being applied. It validates good work, but it also identifies underperformance and provides clarity on what potential project selection should be.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I think coming back to your question on what the deliverables were there, there's obviously the identification of reserve potential, that's a key, but there's also a number of other legacies as well. So we feed back cleansed quality control data sets to the nation. So the data is in a much more improved state than when we began the project. Typically, we have a set of machine learning algorithms which are bespoke for that nation, and we can build all of that into a single easy-to-use solution in BMark. So the client is left with an easy-to-use tool, lots of improved data, and crucially the skills and the knowledge on how to use that tool.
Fantastic. So, by working with the national data set, training bespoke correlations, developing benchmarks and having them ultimately embedded into a customised version of our software, you're getting upfront insights off the back of project completion, but then again, as we mentioned earlier, the positive legacy is these benchmarks can be referred to, data can be updated over time, and there's very, very positive best practice embedded within these organisations.